All right, so the lecture now is going to kind of consist on of the significance of the Protestant Reformation. So, uh, and this is very important because you may ask, why are we talking about the Protestant Reformation? This is the 1500s. Why aren't we talking about American history? But you may have heard that one of the reasons that a lot of the Europeans came over was for religious freedom. And you know, if during when the Catholics, when the Catholic Church monopolized uh, religion in Europe, there was no need to persecute people that were not of um, your religion. However, once we have the Protestant Reformation, all right, once the Protestant Reformation occurs, this changes, and we'll see, for example, what happens in England. But there's other reasons as well. Even though there are a lot of people that are Catholic in South Louisiana, like I said, I grew up Catholic. Many of you may be Catholic. Lake Charles is kind of really a mix. Once you start going more farther east, obviously you see more Catholics in Louisiana. Uh, but the United States is a very Protestant country. So even though the um, we have a lot of different groups of religions, a lot of different Christian groups. We have Buddhists, we have Muslims, we have atheists, we have agnostics. All right, and that's kind of what makes up the United States, the people in the United States. But the majority of people are Protestant, and religion plays a big role in culture. So let's say you grow up let's say in South Louisiana, even if you're not Catholic, all right, we have Mardi Gras off. Now, Mardi Gras is not a celebration that is sanctioned by the Vatican, all right, but it's celebrated in Catholic areas. So, I mean, it's going to have a strong influence on the culture, and the same as, in the Protestant religion has had a strong influence on American culture. All right. And so we'll talk a little bit later on about that debate that I mentioned in the previous lecture about whether the founding fathers, whether the country was founded on Christian principles and they were all Christian. That gets very tricky. And like a lot of things, especially when you study history, there's a lot of nuances there. And it's not, one way or the other. Now, like I said, the media, when you watch, the news, it's always, way over here on the left, you'll have MSNBC, and over here on the right, you'll have, Fox News and CNN. Depending if you're conservative, you feel like CNN's on the left. If you're liberal, you might feel like it's on the right. The thing is that, most people, like when I talk to a lot of students, most people are pretty in between. Uh, Louisiana tends to be pretty conservative for the most part, but then there's a large, I mean, it depends. All right, and still, again, people have common sense. They find some, they'll find a middle ground. But again, I mean, the point that I'm making is that um, the United States is very diverse with a lot of diverse ideas, and when we see debates, regardless of what they are, on the news and the media, because they're trying to get people to watch them. They tend to get people on these extremes. All right, and so same thing in history. When you hear about these different debates, you hear one extreme or the other, and the reality is not always, but a lot of times the reality is, much more nuanced. And of course, when you study history, the goal is not necessarily for you to memorize all the facts so that you have something to talk about at the coffee shop or whatever. The goal is to help you. It's an exercise in thinking critically. All right, to be able to think for yourself. All right, I had a buddy of mine the other day. We were talking about LSU football, and he heard all these rumors, and he said, "Well, I read it on the internet." And I was like, "Well, why? It may not be true." And he's like, "Well, why would they write anything on the internet? That's not true." Well, of course, that happens all the time. And so it's very important, even in these lectures, all right, that I'm giving you, you should approach it in a very critical way. If I say something and I don't kind of, back it up, which happens all the time, you should say to yourself, well, maybe, maybe Neville's is wrong right there. Okay, I mean that's very, very important. All right, and for me, it's always been a matter of pride. I just always wanted to think for myself. Anyway, okay, that's enough of preaching about critical thinking and all that. Um, Now, what there was a lot of different Protestant groups that arose as a result of the Protestant Reformation. Many of them were as hostile to Luther's doctrines as they were to Catholicism. One group was led by John Calvin. He was a um, French Protestant. He was not that different from Luther. Okay, like I said, some of these groups were very hostile to Luther's ideas. Calvin not so much, but he did differ in a couple of ways. Luther in 1536, I'm sorry, not Luther, Calvin in 1536 wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's a very famous book. I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting it and like reading it just for fun, but nonetheless, it's very important. And the two areas that he differed from Luther on was this idea of transubstantiation. Now, the Catholics believe in transubstantiation. What this means is that when you go to communion, the body, the host, actually turns into the body of Christ. That's why people during the Enlightenment would criticize the Catholic Church and call them, Catholics cannibals. Luther didn't agree with this. Luther believed in what he called consubstantiation, which was um, I don't really know how to explain it except to say that it was, the substance did not change. I mean, but the spirit, sort of like the spirit of Christ was in the host. I'm not sure if that's the best explanation, but that's kind of the way I view it, and I think that's probably the easiest way to explain it. Now, what Calvin said, he didn't believe in that either. He just simply said that Christ was present in spirit, and of course you see in the Protestant churches today versus the Catholic mass, the communion is a major part of the Catholic mass. Whereas obviously in a lot of Protestant religions it's not, and a lot of times they just do it out of tradition, that type of thing. This is not that significant in terms of if it how it changed history and all that, uh, as much as this doctrine. Now Luther, originally came up with this doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, and as I said, that was very important in terms of this idea of equality. But he never really did anything with it. I mean, he knew that there had to be some type of hierarchy in the church. But Calvin really believed in it. He supported what's known as a congregational structure. Now, if everyone is equal, okay, everyone interprets the Bible kind of on their own. You go to church, okay, who is going to lead the church? Who's going to lead the congregation? All right, everybody's equal. What happens? Well, the one way you decide, let's say if we all got together at Sewella and to do something, and we had to decide who was going to lead us in some task. We might find somebody that was an expert in that task, or we may find 3 or 4 people that are experts in that task. But you can only have one. How would we decide? Well, they might get up there and talk, and then we could what? Vote on it. All right. So this is like the first little bits of democracy you see in Europe for the first time for a very, very long time, all the way back really to ancient Greek Athens. And of course, this is very important. This is very important. I'm not saying this is where democracy came from. However, it did create a certain culture. And you hear that a lot. I mean, when we talk about culture, Sewella has a certain culture. McNeese State University has a certain culture. People have a culture. In South Louisiana, there's a culture. It's a little bit different than North Louisiana. North Louisiana culture is different than what you'd find in New Orleans or what you might find in New York City. And culture is very important. And kings and aristocrats, this hierarchy that you saw within the society in Europe at that time, these people did not like this idea. Why? Well, if you could choose your religious leaders, then maybe you can also choose your political leaders. And so, if that was the case, um, that would not be good for the people that were at the top of the totem pole. And so, again, what do you call it when the people choose a leader? Well, we call this democracy. I'm just going to abbreviate it there. So, democracy. All right. Now, both capitalism, which is you could say kind of our economic philosophy or economic institution, an economic institution that is really dominating the world today. And there's of course different forms of capitalism. I mean, the French system is different than the American system. The American system is different than the Japanese system. But nonetheless, they are capitalist countries. Now, there's a lot of debate, for example, on how much the government should get involved and all of that. But that's for a different day. And when we look at our political institutions, we think of democracy. Now, of course, we're not a pure democracy. That's important to understand. All right, we are a representative democracy. Our founding fathers knew very well, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, that the majority could be just as tyrannical as a king or a monarch, okay, or a dictator. So we do have representative democracy, but again, we talk about democracy is when we think of our political institutions is sort of like the foundation, and to a large extent, both the Protestant Reformation influenced both capitalism and democracy, and we kind of explained. I'll explain democracy first. I kind of explained it in the previous slide. And again, if you're wondering why my circles and my writing is so bad, it's just because I'm doing it with this little clicker here on my iMac. But we kind of explained it. I mean, if you have this idea of everyone is equal, there's no hierarchy. Everyone has sort of the power of a priest. A priest is not special in any way. And you have a congregation. You have people that come together to worship. You would choose the leaders, and that's exactly what happened, especially once Calvin really propagated his ideas. Now, how in the world did the Protestant Reformation, how did that really influence capitalism and all? Well, I want to make sure you understand that this is not so cut and dry. Okay, I mean this what we're about to talk about here is really just a theory by Max Weber, and that came out of a book written I think in 1905, it may be 1904, early 1900s, called "The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism." And this is an important book. If you ever go on and you study history more at the university level, maybe take 300 or 400 level classes, you'll probably hear of this again. And what Weber said, and again, he's German, so when we say, a lot of people just say Weber, it's no big deal. If somebody says Weber, you don't have to correct them and say, well, actually, it's Weber, but blah, blah, blah. You don't have to do that because, we are from, most of us are from Louisiana, and that's a good way to get punched. So what he said was this idea of predestination, what it evolved into, all right, was this idea that people, all right, were predestined not only to go to heaven or hell, but they were predestined to do their trade. If they were a farmer, or whether they were some type of artisan, or whatever. And a sign that you were going to go to heaven, all right, was that you worked really hard at your job and you saved money. And this eventually evolved into this idea that, your vocation and how well you did in that vocation, your success, again, was a sign that you were going to go to heaven. And that eventually evolved into this idea that, well, if you had riches on earth, if you had things, all right, and this is, again, kind of one interpretation of Weber's thesis here, of his argument, but that was a sign that you were going to go to heaven. Now, for capitalism to work, people have to be motivated. They have to sort of view success as having things. In Catholicism, it's kind of like, the more you have, it's almost sort of a bad thing. You almost kind of feel guilty. But in a lot of Protestant religions, I mean, there's this idea that, well, if you're blessed, I mean, that's kind of comes from this idea of predestination. Even if that particular brand of Protestantism did not believe in predestination. All right, so for capitalism to work, you needed people, to have to work a lot harder than they really needed to work. What Weber and others have said is that it's natural to kind of just go and get by. All right, so I'll post a little bit more about that. There was a video that might kind of help you with that I can post, and I may get you to write a little something on it. But again, this is just an explanation by Weber. It's just again more theoretical than anything, but it certainly has influenced the way a lot of people have viewed capitalism and why it developed and that kind of thing. And this was also kind of against, contradicted Karl Marx. Karl Marx is often known as the father of communism. He wrote the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s, late 1840s. And basically what he said was that the economy drives history. All right, class conflict is in the economy and resources. That's what drives history. Where in this case, Weber contradicts Marx and he says, no, religion in this case actually drove the economy, which changed history. So it was actually an ideology. But anyway, this is just one of the reasons why we study the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is a map that kind of shows you that in these areas in the north, these areas up here, all right, turned Protestant. In the south, we see a lot of Catholicism that remained. In England, again, a lot of Protestantism in certain areas. In France. But that just kind of gives you an idea. Normally, what people will say is that in the north, it turned, it was more Protestant. In the south, it was more Catholic. Okay, so I hope this helps.